All right, today we are following the money. There's this really deep dive report that looked into school voucher programs all across the US, and, well, what it found really makes you ask a pretty big question. Who are these programs actually for? So let's dive right in.
So the whole debate, and really what this report zeroes in on, boils down to this one question. Are school vouchers this brilliant way to save taxpayer dollars, or are they a budget crisis just waiting to happen, kind of hiding in plain sight?
Okay, so let's start with the promise, right? The original idea. It actually goes way back to the economist Milton Friedman. And his thinking was, what if public money could follow the student to any school, public or private? The theory was that this competition would light a fire under all the schools, forcing them all to up their game.
And the financial argument from folks who support this has always been super straightforward. Look, if a voucher costs less than what the state spends on a kid in public school, then every single student who switches saves the state money. I mean, on paper, the math is simple, right?
But, and this is a big but, this is exactly where the report starts to dig in. Because what happens when that simple, on-paper math crashes into the messy reality of a massive statewide program?
Okay, let's take a look at Arizona. It's really become the poster child for these universal voucher programs. When they first rolled out their big expansion, the official, nonpartisan forecast put the annual price tag at around $64 million. You know, a pretty modest number in the grand scheme of a state budget.
So what's the actual cost for the upcoming school year? Get this, $900 million. Yeah, and some forecasts are saying it's going to hit $1 billion not long after that. The difference is just, it's absolutely staggering. And this chart right here just lays it all out, doesn't it? That little bar on the left, that was the projection. That skyscraper on the right, that's the reality. That's what taxpayers are looking at. So you got to ask the big question, why? How did this happen? I mean, how do you explain a budget blowing up by that much? The report says the answer isn't what you might think. It's not that a flood of students suddenly left public schools. Nope, it's something else entirely. And here it is, the report's big reveal for why the costs went through the roof. It all comes down to who is using these vouchers. See that giant 75% slice? Those are students who were already in private school or being homeschooled, so for them, the voucher isn't saving the state a dime. It's a brand new cost. It's basically a subsidy for a choice they had already made and were already paying for. Only that little 25% chunk represents students who actually switched from public school, and that's the only place the state could have saved money. The report says this is the engine driving that massive budget explosion.
So this huge budget shock, that's really just one piece of the puzzle. It naturally leads to the report's next big question. Was the system itself built in a way that, left the door wide open for these kinds of overruns and maybe even misuse of the money?
The analysis points to what it basically calls a two-tiered system of accountability. It's like there are two different sets of rules. On one hand, you've got public schools. They are under a microscope. State monitoring, financial audits, really strict laws about hiring your relatives. But then, on the other hand, you have private schools that are getting public money, and their oversight often gets handed off to private groups. And get this, they're often exempt from the very same ethics laws.
And this table from the report really breaks it down state by state. If you look over at one end, you've got a state like Wisconsin, which has a pretty rigorous system in place. They require independent audits, performance reports, the whole 9 yards. But then you look at states like Arizona, Florida, and the model that the new Texas law is based on, and those same requirements, they're either super limited or they just don't exist at all. The report makes the case that this isn't some oversight, it was a deliberate choice.
And this quote really shows you what happens on the ground when that oversight isn't there. An investigation in Texas, and this is before their universal program even gets going, found tons of examples of stuff that would be totally illegal in a public school. I mean, we're talking about a school trustee's company getting a nearly $500,000 landscaping contract, or another insider raking in over $1 million for printed education material. This is taxpayer money going to places that just don't have to follow the same rulebook.
Okay, so all of this brings us to a really critical question that the report raises. This whole fiscal crisis, the runaway costs, the budget holes it creates, is this just an accident, a bug in the system, or could it actually be a feature of a much bigger political strategy?
The report ties these outcomes to a pretty well-known political strategy called Starve the Beast. And the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. You intentionally create a budget crisis. You can do it by cutting taxes, or in this case, by creating a huge new spending program. And then that deficit you created forces politicians to make massive cuts to other public services.
And wow, this quote from political activist Grover Norquist, which is cited in the report, really just lays the ideology bare.
So the report's argument is this. By creating this separate, publicly funded school system with a price tag that just keeps going up and up, you're essentially manufacturing a crisis that can then be used as the reason to defund and dismantle the traditional public school system.
So, when you look at the final balance sheet that this analysis lays out, what's the bottom line? When the dust settles, who really wins from these universal voucher programs, and who gets left holding the bag?
Well, according to the report, the winners column is pretty clear. You've got the private schools themselves, which get a huge new stream of public money. You have politically connected insiders who can take advantage of those weaker ethics rules. And of course, you have the families who are already paying for private school, who now get a nice taxpayer-funded discount.
And then you look at the other side of the ledger, the losers. The report points to public school systems that now have to deal with budget cuts. It points to low-income and rural families who often have far fewer private options to begin with. And it also highlights students with disabilities who, as the report notes, can actually lose critical legal protections when they move out of the public system.
So, to wrap it all up, the report basically gives a checklist of early warning signs, especially for people in states like Texas that are just heading down this road. Here's what to keep an eye out for. First, costs exploding past the original estimates. Second, a huge number of the voucher users coming from schools they were already in. Third, you'll start hearing talk about cutting other public services to pay for the vouchers. And finally, you'll see news reports about fraud and self-dealing. And so, in the end, this entire analysis really leaves us with one massive critical question. As these voucher programs get bigger and bigger, what level of accountability should you expect for your public money when it's being sent to private institutions? That really is the multi-billion-dollar question at the very heart of this entire debate.